Dr. Senie, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your expertise on this very delicate matter. And I guess my first question may seem like a very basic one, but why are memorials built for instances like this?
Well, that's a really good question because the memorials that are built, for example, to the event that happened in Las Vegas are really memorials to victims. Whereas traditionally, we built memorials to heroes. So building a memorial to heroes, or what we considered heroes at the time when these memorials were erected, I think that's pretty easy to understand. Okay, but when we get to memorials to victims, that's an entirely different category. And I don't know how recent it is. I mean, I have written about this elsewhere. Um, just a more basic question is, can we consider memorials to people, say, who fought in Vietnam and perished? Are they victims? Because you could say that they are victims of a misguided government policy, right? Or if they were drafted, perhaps their participation was not volitional. But when we start building memorials, say, to victims of the Oklahoma City bombing, the Columbine deaths, 9/11, your situation in Vegas, those shootings, I think that's a different issue. And I don't think we've explored enough what it means that our paradigm for memorials has shifted from heroes to victims.
You talked about a number of very famous memorials that have been built. In this instance, the site obviously is very significant, or is it? Do you think this should be built where this concert was across from Mandalay Bay, or what's your opinion on that, Doctor?
Well, just in general, I would say nearly 100% of the time, much as I don't like those kinds of complete generalizations, the site either defines the content or at the very least frames it. And I think we in our culture and many other cultures have a sense that where something happened is somehow significant. In a less valent context than what you're dealing with, George Washington slept here. So, why do we care about these things? But I think it's almost a kind of magical thinking that the ground holds the content. And that if we build a memorial on that ground, it is somehow more valid, more significant, more spiritual almost. Again, given this, I think, rather strange belief that we have, but it's very pervasive. So it depends on where the site is. For example, at Columbine, they moved it as far away from the school as possible. You can't see it from the school. Oklahoma City, they built it right on the site. And a lot of people after that felt they could no longer work in that building because it was a traumatic experience for them every time they entered the building. And something similar happened at 9/11 because that's a huge crosswalk site in Manhattan. Many people pass through there from one side to the other for lunch, for recreational activities, etc. So you have people in that site that are not only there for the memorial, but the memorial itself, I think, is a sufficiently segregated space that one doesn't feel necessarily that intrusion. And I think there's also something to be said for a memorial site that is at least contiguous to a site of life, right? You're not building a cemetery.
That makes sense. Doctor, you gave a very thorough and comprehensive presentation to our 1 October committee, and thank you so much for doing that. And something you said that was very interesting to me, art matters. The better the art, the more successful the memorial. Explain that, and explain how should our committee here select an artist or select an architectural team to help them design this memorial.
Well, let me preface that by saying I'm an art historian, and so I have to believe that art matters. But I really do believe that it does matter. I do believe if you have good art, you are going to have a more profound, a more nuanced, a more significant experience. If you think about the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, the various ways that's been used, the way people have responded to it, immediately. Now, Maya Lin was an architectural student at Yale when she submitted her design, and it was a class assignment. So I don't think you necessarily need a name brand artist. That said, I was on a selection committee not too long ago where none of the artists whom I would have expected to submit a proposal did. And I firmly believe that's because it wasn't advertised in the right places. That's one. The other thing is there are people who have had consultants who've had experience in running these competitions. And you might want to consider hiring one as a consultant because it's complicated, especially if you don't know the players. There's no reason everybody should know the players if it's not their job, right? So that it would simplify the process somewhat, just in terms of narrowing things down. Because my guess is you'll get a lot of applications.
Doctor, are memorials like this typically designed for the public or for the family and the loved ones of the lives lost?
Hopefully for both, and also hopefully for the future. And I think one of the most important things is, I'll come back to the families in a moment. I'm not ignoring them because it's a grievous loss that really can't be measured. I think it's really important that memorials have a place for ongoing discussions because memorials remain the same, but history and people change over time. So the significance of a memorial today is most likely going to evolve into something different in the future, depending on what else happens, depending on the demographics, depending on what happens in your city or your town. So I think somehow to make sure you build in a concept of the future is important. Also, for a memorial to continue to have significance, it has to have celebrations, rituals, whatever. And so I imagine there would be something on the annual anniversary of the event and whatever other dates might be important to the community as well as to the family members. I think family members are super important in terms of recognizing their contribution. And I could, with the contribution that they have to make, I have suggested elsewhere that it might be a good idea to think about the commissioning of memorials as a tripartite process. One is the immediate memorials, like your garden, or the things that people bring to the site. That's a fairly common ritual now, right? Even with the drive-by shootings, people are running to the site and leaving all kinds of things. The intermediate memorial before something else gets built, I would say, is being filled by your community garden, something that family members want and address their needs at the time. There's a special room for 9/11 family members where they could gather to grieve during this awful time. And then the permanent memorial. And I can already tell from the way your commission is set up that you have a pretty good sense of a mix of people who are on it. But I have been involved or have read about other memorial processes where the family members are given the primary role. And I think that that's not going to end necessarily in the best memorial. First of all, we've all had experiences of mourning. When I was mourning the death of my husband some 8 years ago, I was no more able to choose a memorial, and I know how to do this, then I barely could choose what to have for dinner, right? I mean, it's just a terrible time. You're completely flattened. So I know it may feel therapeutic to do that, and it may feel diversionary for family members to do that, but I think that their needs could be addressed more profitably elsewhere, which is not to say they shouldn't serve on a committee or even have a primary role as an advisory contingent, to say what their concerns are, what their experiences were. They were there, most likely the people you bring in to design this thing were not, so there is that. I mean, once you get to selecting an artist, I think you also have to consider how important it is to have a local artist.
Doctor, my last question. One, and something else that I know you've mentioned, that another decision for memorials is whether or not to allow the public to leave keepsakes, maybe some flowers or pictures, photographs, and things like that. Talk to me about what the decision or what needs to be made for something like that.
Well, it was very surprising to me that this was so important to people. It happened at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial even before it was built. The minute they, dug, what do you call it, the construction, people were coming and dropping things into it, personal things, mementos of people who had died, soldiers who had died. And then, of course, it continues, and it's a kind of, it's a continuation of a cemetery ritual, even though obviously the bodies are not buried there. So I think we probably have to recognize the need that people have to do this. But one of the things they found at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was that once they announced they were going to do an exhibition of these objects, selected objects, more people started to leave things as if they wanted their keepsakes to somehow be in an exhibition. So then it becomes a less spontaneous reaction, right? That said, it's my belief, based on my experience, that this is an important thing to people. I think it is important to leave some vehicle for doing it, but then you have to decide, what are you going to do with these objects?
Dr. Harriet Senie, thank you very much for your excellent information on a very delicate subject. We sure appreciate you.
Thanks for the invitation. It was a pleasure.